Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for Takedowns and Takeaways in Federal Receiverships. I'm Kevin Duff, President of the National Association of Federal Equity Receivers and a member of Rackless, Duff & Peel in Chicago, Illinois. We are pleased to be joined today not only by an esteemed panel of experienced receivers, but also by a large, diverse, and talented group of attendees, including from the judiciary, government regulatory agencies, law students, NAFER members, and many others. Our audience today is also international, including attendees from the UK, Canada, Cayman Islands, and Virgin Islands. On behalf of NAFER, welcome everyone. This program is both a step forward in NAFER's delivery of top-shelf educational content, but also is part of the lemonade that NAFER has made from the lemons resulting from the coronavirus pandemic. Normally, NAFER presents several regional events each year. This year, we were unable to do so. But we are pleased with the wonders of technology and a lot of hard work of NAFER's staff and executive director and her team, and dedicated members of NAFER to present today's webinar live and online. I have just a few quick announcements. The annual conference for NAFER this year will be delivered virtually. It will be on Thursday, October 8th from 4 to 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and Friday, October 9th from 11 a.m. to 2:45 Eastern Time. Although we will greatly miss seeing everyone in person, we are excited to be able to offer this excellent program to a wide audience. The full lineup is posted on NAFER's website, and registration for the conference will begin September 1st. As a benefit to NAFER members, the conference will be free of charge this year. If you aren't a member yet, you can join today and then attend the conference for free. The cost of the conference is equal to membership dues for non-members, so it definitely makes sense to become a member and take advantage of the free conference attendance. You may have noticed NAFER's website has recently received several major enhancements. We added a new community for NAFER members to gather and share information. Questions can now be posed to NAFER receivers and receivership professionals through the website or directly through the community email address. And a new robust email profile section makes it easier for others to find NAFER members based on experience. I encourage you to explore the website and to reach out to our NAFER staff with any questions. To our full members in attendance, a reminder that we recently identified the nominees for the upcoming board term. We're excited to have so much interest in serving NAFER and its members. 9 candidates will be on the ballot to fill 5 open positions, and voting for the candidates will begin in early September. Finally, a few notes for today's Zoom webinar. First, unlike a Zoom meeting, you can see us, but we cannot see you, nor can we hear you, although we understand there's in excess of 175 people online today. All attendees are on mute and off camera, so no need to worry how you look today, but as Billy Crystal would have intoned, I'm sure you look marvelous. You have a control panel. To access your Zoom options, it's the little black bar that typically appears when you hover your cursor down toward the bottom of your screen. From there, you can access the question and answer feature, which is what you can use to pose questions to our panelists. We may not get to all of them, but we'll do our best. There's also a chat feature you can use to communicate with fellow attendees. Please note that questions presented through the chat feature may not get posed to the panelists, so please be sure to use the Q&A feature for that. Also, NAFER is not providing CLE for this webinar, although NAFER is CPE certified. So we will be doing engagement poll questions throughout the webinar so that you can get CPE credit if that's what you're looking for. We will send certificates of attendance within a couple weeks to those who requested through the survey following today's webinar. You must have answered the engagement poll questions to receive the certificate, so please keep an eye out for those. Now I'd like to introduce my co-host today, Kathy Bezoyan-Phelps. Kathy is a partner at Diamond McCarthy LLP in Los Angeles and a NAFER board member. Those of you who know Kathy also know she's a fabulous educator. Kathy?
Thank you, Kevin, and welcome everybody. One other housekeeping matter that I want to make sure, since a bunch of us are lawyers on the call, is that we are recording the session today. So if you don't want to be recorded and don't consent, hang up now. So let me introduce the other faces that you see on the screen, our presenters today. We're really excited to have some just fabulous, very experienced receivers. Let me start with Melanie Damian. She's the co-founder of the law firm Damian and Valori LLP in Miami, Florida. And she regularly serves as a court-appointed federal equity receiver. She also serves as a special monitor and a distribution agent. She also serves as counsel to receivers in both federal and state court. And for NAFER, Melanie is the chair of the Regulatory Outreach Committee. So thank you, Melanie, for being here with us today. Next, we have Stephen Donnell. And Steve is the president of both Fed Receiver Inc. and Jalmar Properties in Los Angeles, California. And Steve has served as a federal and state court receiver in hundreds of receivership cases, I think maybe even more than 700. He also frequently serves as an expert witness with, I think, a pretty big focus on real estate issues. And for NAFER, Steve was actually our first president. So he is a past president here with us today. So thank you, Steve, for joining us. And then next I have Jonathan Perlman. And Jonathan is a partner at Genevieve's Job Love and Batista law firm, and he in Florida as well. He has also served as a federal receiver in numerous actions brought by the SEC, the FTC, and the Florida Attorney General. And Jonathan's practice focuses on fraudulent and deceptive practices, among other things. And for NAFER, Jonathan serves on the board of directors. So thank you, Jonathan, for being here with us today, too. So I know that we have today with us a lot of NAFER members. Thank you for participating. And we also have a lot of folks who are not yet NAFER members. And we hope that you find the presentation today intriguing. We hope that we are intriguing anyway. What we want to do today is to share with you a lot of our stories. Some war stories, but it's not really a war story panel. It's war stories with a twist. We really want to share teachable moments that have come out of these war stories. I mean, receivers are on a wild ride and an adventure from the day they get appointed as receiver in a case. And there's a lot of fabulous success stories along the way. There are also some challenges. I won't call them mistakes, but, you know, mishaps along the way. And from each one of those, we all learn. And so we want to share some of them with you today so that you can get a little bit of a flavor, if you're not familiar with receiverships, about what it's like. And for those of you who do know what it's like, maybe learn something from somebody else's experiences. So we're going to structure this kind of walking through some of the more typical things that happen in a typical receivership case by event. And we're going to start today with the takeover. That first day, you've been appointed. Often those are some of the most colorful stories. So let's start with just maybe your funniest or your oddest story and what you learned from it in a receivership case. And Steve, why don't we start with you?
Hi, good afternoon. Yeah, one takeover that stands out is part of a government enforcement case. I was ordered to take possession of the principal's primary residence. It was a very, very large estate in the Beverly Hills area. And so we got to the home and promptly found out that he had been running essentially a brothel, a high-end brothel out of his house. And his employees were present. And I had to remove those 5, 6, 7 ladies who didn't really seem to care that I had a court order in my hand and were not too pleased. So that was my first experience with that particular government enforcement case, shutting down a brothel. Something I'll never forget.
Melanie, what about you?
Well, I hate to outdo Steve, but I didn't take over a brothel, but mine too, my most interesting one is also a house. I had to take over a relatively minor Ponzi schemer. His name was Sean Healy. He had taken money from a bunch of people, about $11 million, and only spent it on things. He didn't even pretend to invest it in anything, which was lucky for us because he didn't lose that much. And we were able to recover a lot from selling the things that he had bought, including luxury cars and this house. And so we got there to take over the house. And also, and this will be the learning lessons, I think it was my first receivership as a federal equity receiver. And we did not bring enough people to handle the situation. And so There were police there, and luckily the defendant had decided to call his attorney, who I knew well. So by grace, we had a sane person there to help keep people in line. But we had a list from the SEC of what he had spent the money on. So $11 million worth of jewelry and cars and things. And so the jewelry and the gold and things like that, we were really concerned about getting. So we had the list, and we were kind of asking them, where is this? Where is this? Where's this 10-carat ring? And they threatened to throw my partner out a window. And poor Kenny, I think some people on the call probably know Kenny. I had a very large partner there, and then relatively, he's a small guy, and he threatened to throw him out the window. But that's actually not the most interesting part. We get to the point where we're searching the house, and we have a video camera, and the wife of the defendant had been a stripper, so there's a common theme. And she had decided, because we were videoing, that she would do a dance. And so we're inspecting the house. She's doing a striptease dance. And it turns out, at first we're like, are they just crazy, or are they on drugs, or what's going on? It did turn out that somehow during the middle of our search, because we didn't have enough people there to really keep control, they had taken cocaine, started doing the striptease, and it was all to distract us from one of the safes that was in the upstairs bedroom. And so luckily, Kenny was more uncomfortable than distracted, and we found the safe. And so that was definitely one of the strangest, and a lot of lessons learned from that takedown.
Melanie, as a little pitch for NAFER and the not taking enough people, NAFER is such a fabulous organization with such a close-knit group of people, and actually representing Melanie in a case, when I was doing a takeover for her as local counsel, didn't have enough people and was able to pick up the phone and pull in another NAFER member on an hour's notice, if less than that, to get help. So just a little pitch for the organization.
That is a great pitch, because that saved us that day. We had discovered, we were in the middle of a takedown. We had discovered an office in the same city, but not in the same location, that we needed to get in right away. Thank you for doing that, by the way.
No problem.
I was like, sure, I have people there.
Jonathan, what about you? What's your honest story?
I'm not as funny as you guys, and a lot of the ones that are not right for prime time, I was just afraid to tell you, but I certainly never was distracted from the safe by the striptease. But every case has very interesting things and surprises, I think, as you called it before. What came to mind when you were talking about the topic was we had just taken down or had done an immediate access on a national debt relief company, about $85 million scam. And we were sitting in the late afternoon of the first day of the takedown. We had done all of our interviews, and we were sitting discussing, yes, the company was clearly highly profitable, but we were discussing whether the company was operating as unlawfully as the government had alleged, and what evidence existed and had been corroborated, which is one of our core day 1, 2, 3 duties. And a young associate who was part of my team comes up to the office where we're talking about this and says, there's someone here to pick up the company's garbage, and asks if he can allow the person to come do what they're supposed to do. And I said, well, let me meet him. And so I meet this gentleman, and he's in a custodial uniform, and I ask him, what garbage are you here to take, and why? And he was with a service, and he said he has a regular job to come every once in a while to go pick up these giant locked big garbage cans that they had at the office. This is a big office with giant boiler rooms, which he replaces with a smaller one, where everything gets shredded, and they replace it with the one that's not shredded. So then I ask him the natural question, which is this your regular scheduled pickup day? And he says, no. And I said, then why are you here today? And he tells me, because someone called me today and said that my team needed for an urgent pickup today to have all of our documents shredded. So needless to say, instead we had him use his keys to unlock these giant garbage cans. And my associates still talk about this as the day they went dumpster diving. And we took all these pieces of paper, and we had tape, and we glued them all back together again. And within all of these torn up documents were documents that showed dispositively that the company's in-house law firm was stealing monies directly from consumers under the guise of fraudulent legal settlements, where they were telling the consumer that they'd gotten a settlement for them for, say, $1,000, but the actual settlement documents showed that they had achieved settlements between $15,000 to $100,000, and it basically immediately put us in a different phase of the case and was very helpful to the court. So you never know what's going to happen. Check the garbage, even if it's locked.
All right, so we've got shredded documents, striptease, brothel. So welcome to the world of receiverships. Do each one of you, just in a real quick snippet, have your best advice for a rookie receiver in a takeover? Steve?
I would say the best advice is initially go in, don't trust anybody, assume that you don't know who the players are. I've also seen there's a lot of nepotism in these fraud cases, and so there are wives, brothers, children. So the person that you're speaking to that you think you might trust might be a relative of the principal Ponzi operator or fraudster. So just do your homework, but don't trust anybody until you verified exactly who the players are.
Melanie?
I agree not to trust anyone. I'll give another plug to NAFER because we have great first day takedown checklists, which are really good. And then I also recommend that you keep your own sort of checklist as you learn different lessons, and bring enough people. That was sort of the point. You need to make sure, I mean, the best you can, knowing what you can find out before you get there. Make sure you have enough people so that you can secure the premises and that you have law enforcement available. One of the lessons I learned that day that we were talking about is there were guns in the house, and that was something that wasn't on my radar screen. And now it's something I ask right away with the police, with law enforcement, to determine whether there's any guns and make sure you get the guns. I mean, I haven't luckily had any bad experiences, but I have taken down a lot of places where later we find weapons on the premises. And so that's something that I added to my day one checklist that I didn't have before. So bring enough people, don't trust anyone, and check for the guns.
Jonathan, what about you?
I wholly concur with Melanie and Steve. And I also will give NAFER a plug. If you like the checklist we already have, we're about to introduce the latest, greatest, most complete checklist ever for all the membership and for everybody else who's interested. So that's coming within the month. In addition, there's so many important things, but I would put as the top two is your team needs to be really good interviewers, really good with the nose to cross-examine people and get out from them, because people want to talk. And there's going to be people when you do your immediate access who are dying to talk. You just have to have the right way of asking them the questions. And the other thing I would say that is, especially in the last couple of years, is ask the people how they're communicating in the business, because it used to be emails were everything for us, and you just get the computers and you had the emails. Now, if you ask them and they tell you they use WhatsApp or they use texts, you have them immediately hand their phone to you, and you can scroll through them, and you can have IT people there who will immediately make a copy. And I've had at least 3 cases where that was the dispositive evidence that got them in big trouble.
That's a good segue to thinking about receiverships in the current environment where we have this pandemic, and now we have to really explore how to accomplish things in a limited environment. Jonathan and Melanie, I understand that you've had receiverships in the last few months where you've had to take actions in the virtual way, in a remote way. Can you comment on some of those experiences?
Yeah, I mean, we've had one takeover during this time, but they didn't have, luckily for us, live operations where we needed to go and interview people. So it was a call and talk to the people situation. I'm using Zoom though. I think obviously telephone calls aren't as good as being able to see people. It's not as good as seeing people in person. but seeing people through Zoom. And in terms of the companies we're operating, because I have several companies right now that are large and unwieldy, and they, before the COVID, had 5 offices in different countries, and I am doing that also through Zoom. And what my advice on that is over communicate. I have scheduled with every business unit, I have at least 1 weekly call. So for the finance department, I have a weekly call. For the content department, a weekly call. And so with each business segment, and then they communicate on Slack. So I got on it so I could just watch what's going on in a day. And so I think Jonathan's advice was good. Find out how people are communicating, and then become part of that. If you're going to have to operate the company, become part of that business so you can watch all the ways that people are communicating and get to know what's going on.
Jonathan, what are some of the lessons you've learned during the pandemic?
We've actually had the good or bad experience of doing 2 takedowns during COVID, one in May and one in July. The first one, which was like Melanie's experience, it was a hedge fund, and even though it was based here in the US, it was registered in Cayman. It had offices in London, Australia, and all over the world. And it was a virtual takedown. There actually were no longer any offices. They were operating on a skeletal staff, all operating remotely from their homes somewhere. And the records in this case were entirely in disarray. They really didn't exist. They didn't have an accounting department. They'd gotten rid of that 6 months ago. And worse yet, the takeover had been done by consent with the government. So you didn't have the benefit of a TRO motion and all the papers from the government's investigation laying out a lot of the evidence and how to find it. I jump on board. Virtual is a very, very poor substitute. Your inability to do the immediate access, to see the operation in action, to interview everyone live, with the emotional impact of, oh, they got us and it's a surprise, and having law enforcement, it's just not as good. But there's nothing you can do about it. You also can't grab the cell phones. People are often lawyered up, and there's an increased chance of theft and sabotage, and we've seen that. We've in fact, in that case, we had that happen with backdoors being created by the IT person who would at night, after this, our IT experts who were extremely experienced had seized total control. He'd sneak a little loop in there, and it would send blind copies of certain emails to the scammer, and other tricks like that. The other problem with the virtual, especially if it's large like this, is you're going to have to keep on board people who are working there, because they're the only ones that know how to do it and where everything is, yet you don't trust them. And there's darn good reason not to trust them, but you just gotta transition as quickly as you can. So I mean, that would be all the problems I see right on the virtual. It's not my favorite. Now, I told you we did a second one as well. That was a COVID one up in Central Florida in July. And that one was live because they were operating. The government couldn't come to our takedown because they weren't allowed to travel. This was FTC from Chicago yet. So we had to go in by ourselves with law enforcement. And it was great that we did, because we were able to grab a couple of interviews, and it was one of those cases where we asked how they communicated. Somebody said WhatsApp, and Irina Sadovnik, my counsel, she was interviewing the woman, started immediately videoing her WhatsApp. And in the WhatsApp were admissions that they had been directed by the purported innocent member of the scam to shred documents and to do all kinds of things. And she said she didn't even know what was happening there. And that's what the judge ended up quoting. So one that showed, again, in-person is such a big improvement. Now, the bad news is the day after we interviewed everybody, several tested positive, and then we had to go home and be quarantined and get tested. But we followed CDC regs, and none of us tested positive.
Well, that's a good outcome. Melanie, have you identified any pitfalls in this environment?
I mean, yeah, I mean, those are the pitfalls. We also did, I mean, we had to take over a house, and I think it's the same, you know, we're not being able to have as much in-person contact, be there, change the locks, scan, you know, we're getting things, but it's slower, and we don't know what we're losing yet. And so I think that's the problem. I mean, there's nothing, I don't think there's a substitute to talking to people in person. And all the way across. I mean, that's why I'm trying to use Zoom. And so that's a better substitute than talking to people on the phone, but it's definitely not as good as being there.
You know, Jonathan, you just said something which, if I heard you right, is a new concept to me about videoing somebody's phone and their text chats and WhatsApp. I love that idea. That's a new tip for me.
That might be the first time we did it, and you know, council was just thinking on her feet quickly.
Oh yeah, that's a great tip.
And,
anyway,
but I'll tell you, it was also IT couldn't image that WhatsApp stream. So if we didn't do it, it wouldn't exist. And since then, everyone's WhatsApp has broken mysteriously.
A great tip, and you only have that opportunity on that first day and catching them by surprise. So let's move on to the asset recovery phase of a receivership case. So let's share any stories that you guys have about the most creative or unusual way that you uncovered an asset. Steve, what about you?
Yeah, I was appointed as a federal equity receiver over a distribution company, and I was given their main office location in the Midwest. So I showed up unannounced and was able to gain access to the office through the landlord, and it was a warehouse with office space built out, and it had been abandoned, and there was a lot of trash, furniture, but none of the inventory, no computers, some empty filing cabinets, and just things kind of strewn around. And so I was just, you know, looking around, figuring that the items that remained were useless. And I found a random sticky note that was on a desk, and it just had the word lease and a phone number. So I figured, all right, I'll call this number. And it ended up being a local real estate broker. And I asked him if he had worked with the company that I had just taken over. And he said, yeah, we were working on negotiating a lease. And I said, did you consummate the lease? He said, no, they ended up going to actually another state. And so he told me where they went. And I went to that other state, and they had left about a week before there. And then I went up to actually Illinois, and ultimately found them in this third location. So had I not picked up that random Post-it note and decided to call some random number, millions and millions of dollars of inventory very likely would have been liquidated because they were in the process of selling it. So stroke of luck.
Excellent. Melanie, what about you?
Well, this should be on the first takedown checklist like several times, but insurance. Always, always, always find out all about the insurance. And one interesting story I have is that we collected life insurance for a fraudster Ponzi schemer named Aubrey Lee Price. He had purportedly got on a barge in Fort Myers to Key West and jumped off. That was the story. Called his friends, threw the phone overboard, said he was gone. We collected all the life insurance. And then a year later, they found him driving through Ocala on his way to his grow house. So he was living in Florida, growing weed for a living. And so, you know, obviously the insurance company wanted the money back, and we were able to keep it because of a law in Georgia that permits, if you weren't engaged in the fraud on the insurance company faking the death, and you have relied on the funds, we had to distribute them. So that's another good lesson. Distribute the funds to the victims as soon as possible, because if you still have them, you might have to give them back. We had distributed the funds, and the judge let us keep a majority of the funds from the life insurance policy.
Wow, and I'm assuming the insurance company won't pay out again when the guy actually dies.
No.
I don't think so.
Jonathan, what about you?
I thought I'd give you one that goes to good fortune. We were doing a receivership. It was a robocall business site scam where they pretended to be Google and threatened to remove businesses' Google listings if they didn't pay up. In fact, one of the defendants invented the robocall, so he's personally responsible for many billions of robocalls. And so we had this takedown. And what happens is that the main defendant flies his stepbrother down from Pennsylvania, gives him $107,000 in cash, wrapped it in tinfoil, a bunch of Rolex watches, a couple four-wheelers, and gives him a rental car with a trailer behind it, and says, "Brother, take this back up to Dad because the FTC has sued me." He tells the brother, "Don't stop for anything. Don't even go to the bathroom. Just bring a jug, fill it in the jug," which was there. He starts driving from Florida. He hits Sumter, South Carolina. He sees a police car, and he starts driving really slow, so slow that the police car, not really having any suspicion of him, just stops him to see if everything is okay. He freaks out. He asks the cop, "Do you want to know what's in my truck?" The cop says, "Sure, what's in it?" He says, $107,000 wrapped in tinfoil, Rolex watches, et cetera, et cetera. So the police officer, logically thinking, okay, this is drugs or money laundering, takes him in. They run the brother's name. They see the FTC case. They start investigating him with U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and they do a big interrogation of him. The female officer gets him crying, and I have the whole transcript because they provided it to me, and gets him to call the brother to see if he'll make an admission when he calls him, which he does. And then Homeland, the bad news is Homeland decides that based on this, they're going to keep the cash because he was supposedly transferring money across state lines without a license, which you don't need. You can transfer your own money. And the Sumter police, who during the entire investigation were trying on all the watches, initially decided that they were going to keep all the watches. After a lot of legal maneuvering, we got our court to order all that, the Homeland and Sumter police to turn over everything to me. And now I have good title to the watches, but now the FTC has come in and they're claiming an interest in the cash because they say I cannot trace where exactly the individual defendant got that cash before he gave it to his brother. And the defendant, of course, has taken the fifth. So stay tuned.
All right, so those are all really good cases of, wow, you lucked out and you got some great assets. What about woulda, coulda, shoulda? Something that just slipped through your fingers that you didn't quite get that you were hoping to. Steve, do you have any stories?
Yeah, I've got one that still smarts a bit, still hurts. This was in an SEC case where we had done a great job of tracing money and it went all over the place. We identified millions of dollars that went to Turkey to one of the defendant's relatives. I retained local counsel in Turkey, and to my great surprise, fraudulent transfer. There's a mirror of the fraudulent transfer laws in Turkey, and I was actually very surprised about that. We then we went through the process and determined that we had to work with law enforcement to try to get levies on bank accounts, etc. Despite the fact that we had wire transfers, we had bank accounts, we knew the bank where the funds initially went to, although we didn't know that it was still in the account. And I had my federal order appointing receiver. What I learned is in Turkey, unless there's a criminal indictment or something similar, that law enforcement just won't help you at all. This was a couple of years ago. Maybe things have changed. We gave it to them on a silver platter. We showed them millions of dollars, where it went, when it went, and they basically said, nope, unless a criminal indictment has been handed down, we won't help you at all. And I had to walk away from the money.
Wow. Melanie, what about you?
I think we're going to see a common theme. Mine is a Latin American investment. I think sometimes when money goes abroad, it's the hardest thing. Often you get lucky, or the laws are good, or the money's where it's supposed to be, or it's with somebody that's cooperative. But we had a telecom investment in Guatemala that we never could recover. We chased it to the point where it didn't make any sense to chase it anymore, because it wasn't a huge investment, and they had shut the company, started a new company. So we were chasing for a while, but it got to the point where we didn't think it was going to be worth chasing after anymore. But it was super frustrating, because we knew that they were also fraudsters in on the fraud, and that was just another fraud, and it wound up being not worth it. So yeah, that happened. I think it mostly happens with foreign assets.
Yeah. Okay. What about you, Jonathan?
Well, Melanie's better than me, because for me it happens not only for foreign assets but U.S. assets. We foreign assets, we've struggled in certain countries that wouldn't assist. We've struggled breaking Cook Island trusts, where the monies are in Switzerland, but the trust is Cook Island. We also, there's always, in my cases, it sounds like there's gold somewhere. I had one case where the guy even put all his gold coins on the on the initial disclosure before he clammed up and took the fifth. But when the court finally let us into his home, it was supposed to be in his safe. The gold coins were gone, and now he's taking the fifth. And these people use gold to live on. Although the safe did have a dozen AK-47s, so there's your guns for you.
There's your guns.
So for the panel, I was wondering if anybody has a question or a comment on maybe a smoking gun document or piece of evidence that you've come across. Say, Steve, is there a case that you've had where there's been a particularly instructive piece of evidence that you've gotten that was really a smoking gun in the case, and how did you find it?
Yeah, this was a case that had a ton of investors, very document heavy, both paper and digital. And I had interviewed all of the employees, or all of the employees that I knew of, and began to formulate who I thought was material and important, and then figured, others are support players. But you never know until the end of the day who's important. And we quickly determined that many documents had been deleted off of a lot of individual desktops. But through my forensic accountants and my computer consultants, we went to the server. They had both a physical server, and then there was a cloud server. We then we were able to do a look at the footprint, the digital footprint of a bunch of deletions. And we found that there were tens of thousands of files that had been deleted, and we were able to trace those deletions to a particular employee who had otherwise made himself out to be just a bit player. And it turned out that he really held the keys to the kingdom of the documents and the records. And so being able to trace that digital fingerprint led us to somebody that we were able to put some pressure on, and he essentially turned on his former employer, and really helped us uncover a lot of assets. And talking about digital footprints, really quick, word to the wise here. Part of my takedown, I showed up at a premises with my whole team. The government was there, and we were going through, waiting for the government to image and law enforcement to image the servers. One of my team members' phones was running out of batteries, so he plugged a USB into a monitor of a computer. And one of the agents looked over and said, "Where did this cord come from? That wasn't here before." And my guy raised his hand and said, "Oh, I'm just charging my phone." And he said, your phone content and your digital prints of your phone, you're now part of this investigation. That leaves a digital footprint on the defendant's computer. So don't touch the computers until they're imaged and have been turned over. And don't try to plug your phone into a monitor or a computer to recharge, because it leaves a trail.
And one of the questions that just came in from the audience, Steve, was, is it safe to then say that any accomplished receiver should have a good IT team behind him or her?
Absolutely. It's really important, especially, dealing with cloud-based, making sure that people don't have remote access. We also have a chain of custody issue that we have to preserve if law enforcement's involved on the criminal side. And so we always bring IT folks day one with us on the takedown to make sure that we're preserving and properly imaging the evidence, and that we are then able to make representations, ultimately through declarations, etc., that we have a proper chain of custody of those computers. So very, very important at the takedown day one.
That's great. Melanie, we received a question from the audience asking, what's the best way to manage the volume of electronic documents that you could encounter in a receivership?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Steve on making sure you have good IT people there, and that's one of the like very primary conversations you're going to have with the regulators if it's a regulatory receivership, because they have different preferences of whether they want to use their in-house people, whether you're going to have your outside people, whether you're going to have both, and you're going to share information. And so, you know, in terms of dealing with the volume, it depends on the case. You know, you're going to want to use some document management system like Relativity if you're going to have a large volume of documents, because you're going to want to be able to search them. You know, there's a lot of, you know, depending on the size of the company, there's a lot of really advanced technologies now. Like I'm loving NetSuite and some of the great accounting softwares now that really permit you to do searches, which before we were at you know, we had to have all the bank records reconstructed, and now the technology is so good that once you have the bank records, you can scan them and compare them to the in-house documents, and you can get your forensic accounting done so much faster than we could even like 3 years ago. So I think technology is changing every day, and I think the receivers really need to stay on top of it so that we're making the best use of our time and making sure we're not missing assets, because having that forensic accounting done sooner is going to help you recover assets quicker, because the forensic accounting usually tells a huge story of what's happened. You know, where the money goes tells a lot of information about what's happening.
Jonathan, do you have a smoking gun story to tell?
I think I've already given you a good smoking gun story. I mean, I can give you more.
I'll tell you what, why don't you, how about maybe it's most surprising place you've ever found a document?
Most surprising place we've ever found a document. Okay. I was just thinking this actually the same robocall receivership that I talked to you about. When we took, in that case, when we went into the actual business premises, and there were two locations, actually two locations in the United States, and simultaneously one in the Dominican Republic. But we also wanted to serve, obviously, the individual defendant, and we knew where his home was. But what we had the FTC agreed to do was, let's serve the companies and have the process server just wait outside the door of where the defendant lived and see what happens. And it turned out to be a really good strategy, because while the process server was monitoring what's happening, the individual defendant and another defendant, so we got two, not just one, came running out of the house, sprinting, with Louis Vuitton backpacks on their backs, with laptop computers sticking out of the top of the backpacks, jumped in the car and sped off. And of course, the affidavit of the process server, we go to the court, we say, you got to turn those over. They get a criminal attorney, they argue Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, and we get, well, I'm now the proud owner of Louis Vuitton bags and the laptops, which even though they claim they were personal laptops, the fleeing, the judge found, was the evidence that all we needed to show that they were business. Additionally, the judge said, since we established they were business, that they would have to give up the passwords to get into the computers, because notwithstanding their testimonial privilege under the Fifth Amendment, we opened the laptops and it has all the incriminating iMessage, they're doing Apple messaging, communications you could want, and all the money moving in and out of the scam and everything else they're doing. So that was a real, luckily, a good idea for us.
Melanie, have you had any success with any particular discovery techniques?
So I'm quick to file the show cause motion, because usually the receivership order has a number of things that the defendants are supposed to do. And if they're not doing it, I file the motion for an order to show cause. and get them into court. That usually will break them free, because I think the strategy is often get away with as much as you can, right? See how far you can push it. And so I think setting the message early that, you know, they're not going to be able to push it far by filing the motion and making them explain themselves to the court. And, you know, really parsing that testimonial privilege, because a lot of times they say, oh, well, I'm going to take the fifth, so I don't have to do anything that's in this receivership order. And, you know, the case law doesn't support that. You know, if they want to assert it, they have to do it on an item by item basis. And they can't assert it as it relates to business, as Jonathan was saying. So, you know, getting into court with your show cause motion as soon as you need to, not being afraid to pull that trigger, I think is important.
We actually have a question from one of the attendees. Have any of you ever had a case where evidence has actually been destroyed and that the person destroying the evidence has faced any kind of consequence, any criminal liability or anything like that? Have you guys ever had that?
I've pursued spoliation issues. The judge in our case just didn't want to go there. Just said there wasn't enough absolute proof of intent, even though I thought there was. And the judge's position was he wasn't going to be there to punish. It was bizarre. That did happen one time. I had absolute evidence. Judge wouldn't do anything about it.
Yeah, I think it happens every time. I'm trying to think of a case where someone didn't destroy evidence. But I think it comes up, it winds up hurting them. I mean, I haven't filed a motion for spoliation, but when you're reporting the compliance or non-compliance, you know, the fact that they didn't turn it over, they deleted certain files, you know, like, you know, even if they have a reason why, you know, they don't have any records later than a month ago because they automatically delete after, you know, or whatever it is. I think it ends up hurting them, even if it's not a specific motion.
Right.
I've had that happen in numerous cases, but there's also a difference between our role and the government's. So the question is it going to help the government in their case against them or criminally? But we have had them. So if they're just doing information, what are we going to get out of it? But I've had where they steal things that we know exist and we can prove it, and then it's gone because they've spent it, and we've gotten orders of contempt where they actually have to come up with cash to give us the reasonable value of it, else they're going to jail. And somehow they've come up with the cash, and whenever I get that cash, it makes me worry that there's a lot more assets out there that I don't know about.
Or who else are they defrauding to get the cash? Exactly. All right, let's move to the litigation phase of a receivership case. So what's the most unusual defendant that you've sued with or without success, I suppose? Who's got a story? Steve?
Yeah, one of the winners in my case, one of my cases, I sued the winner, the net profiteer, and there's no profits in a Ponzi scheme, as we know. He indicated that he had donated a sizable portion of his money to the Church of Scientology, and so I initiated an action against the church, provided every bit of evidence that we had the rights to the funds, and the church was not cooperative at all. Ultimately, the winner cut a deal with the church, and it's a bit of a sad story, but the bottom line is he returned about 80% of what he gave to the church. I avoided the legal fees, but they excommunicated him, so he was no longer allowed to be part of the church. And I thought that was an interesting approach that particular church took. And they fought me tooth and nail in my initial efforts to recover the money from them. So that was, it was successful, but it was a little disheartening at the same time.
Melanie, what about you?
We had to sue through to jury trial a borrower from the Ponzi scheme who was also an investor. So as an investor, he was a net loser, but he also borrowed with separate transactional documents, borrowed money from the Ponzi scheme entity. And so we sued for recovery of the loan, and they wanted to take a defense that overall in the net transactions between the parties, that they were losers, and we wound up having to try that all the way to jury trial and won and recovered the loan. It was a couple $1 million, and so it made a difference in that case.
I'd actually be curious to see that decision. That's an interesting one. All right, and what about you, Jonathan?
You know, one of the things I've noticed over time is that the Ponzi schemers tend to be very easily schemed and scammed by others. And in one of my cases, the Ponzi schemer took his hard-won monies from consumers, and he used it to lend millions of dollars to a coal mine in Kentucky. It's actually a note, but it was secured by 100% ownership of the mine. And so we had to go to Eastern Kentucky and foreclose on this coal mine. Of course, this is fairly recent, and there is no more coal mines are basically all going out of business because of the economy and a lot of other reasons, which maybe is for the best. But somehow, nonetheless, even though the coal mine closed, even though the coal mine is closed, my counsel was able to magically extract several millions of dollars from the mine's owner based on the mining equipment for the coal mine, that even though it was underground and apparently underwater, literally right now, had value, and was able to perform that bit of magic for me and for the victim. So I was pleased.
Communications with creditors are always central to any receivership. Steve, do you have any surprising experiences or information that you've learned from communications with a creditor?
Yeah, well, you know, again, this kind of goes back to the issue of really don't trust anybody. One of the creditors that I was dealing with, it was trying to recover money and pursue a claim. One thing led to another, and as I got in deeper into the case, and this was months into the case, it turned out that one of the creditors was the ex-wife of the main defendant. And I didn't know that he had an ex-wife. I furthermore found out that at one point she worked for the company, and she essentially aided and abetted his conduct. And so I found it ironic that she was seeking a claim when ultimately she ended up being a target. She didn't disclose her relationship with him to me at all. So I was definitely surprised to find out that she was the ex-wife of the perpetrator, and her claim was not approved. I'll leave it at that.
Jonathan, how about yourself?
Well, I had a guy show up at our offices unannounced one day, and he claimed that he, not my receivership, even though I had a deed, owned a nice piece of waterfront property. And I asked him why. And he explained that the Ponzi schemer had promised him that piece of real estate for services rendered. I asked him, what are the services that you rendered? And it turns out that this creditor was the vice president of a very large bank in town. And then he told us the multiple ways that he had aided the schemer and used the bank to aid and abet the scheme, including having the fraudster remove himself at times from the Sunbiz corporate records and insert a straw man, bringing the scheme back to this bank after it had been kicked out and after other banks had kicked him out for, fraudulent conduct that those banks eventually picked up on. So he became featured in a lawsuit that we have ongoing now against a major bank.
I'm going to give each of you an opportunity to give a practical tip you've learned in dealing with or managing creditors. Melanie?
So I think a good one is have a website right away so that you're able to communicate with people and have frequently asked questions. We also always do, when it's a case with a lot of creditors, have a dedicated phone line, a separate number that somebody's answering, especially in the first 2 weeks, answering, 24/7. And after that, answering at least daily, returning phone calls of people. So the website and the phone number, I think, are our two primary things. We're now, I always try to have a meeting of creditors and talk to them, have a live meeting. Now I'm doing those by Zoom. But I try to do those regularly because I think it alleviates some of the pain for people to have somebody to talk to and know what's going on. And so I think that's an important thing to do.
Steve?
Yeah, whether it's investors or consumers, depending upon the nature of the case and the regulatory cases, I have found that I want to make sure that myself and my staff, that we really initially try to put ourselves into the shoes of the defrauded investor or consumer. Oftentimes they've been so upset that by the time the receiver is appointed, a lot of time has gone by and they're really, really upset to begin with. Or just the opposite happens, that in the case of a Ponzi scheme, the Ponzi payments stop when the receiver shows up. So I've found that a lot of the investors blame the receiver for the failure of the payments, and a lot of their anger is directed at the receiver. The receiver has caused this problem. The government is wrong. And so these investors are angry, they're confused, and I try to show some empathy and compassion, and I try to take the time to educate them about the facts, and I tell my staff the same thing, because I can't certainly talk to 10,000 people at once. And once the facts get out through a website, through pleadings, through reports, you know what, at the end of the day, the light bulb goes on. But that initial period of the case, I try to approach it by being a little bit of a human being, putting myself in their shoes. And I find that goes a long way to try to disarm people and let them know that you're a human being just like they are.
Jonathan, how about yourself?
I agree with Steve and Melanie entirely. I hadn't done the Zoom calls, which I think is an excellent idea. I have a great staff who supplements my communications with them and shows them all the empathy. I tell you, the reason I love this practice, doing this job, it is part because I get these Christmas cards from victims of scams over the years, or I get a card that says, because of that distribution, my son had a Christmas present. Those are priceless. The only thing I would add to what they said is I'm very careful to try to set low expectations for the creditors early on. It's not what they want to hear, but they also know that I, just like Melanie and Steve, are going to work so hard to do right by them and get the best possible result we can. And that's the only reason we really exist.
All right, guys, we could go on for hours. We're barely making a dent in all the stuff we could talk about. So I think we probably have time for about one more question. And let's talk about, oftentimes there's a parallel criminal proceeding in these cases. So what have you done right or wrong in connection with a parallel criminal proceeding? Anyone have any stories? Steve?
Yeah, well, there was a particular case I was involved in where, Kathy, you happen to be involved in it as well, where I was appointed in district court by a judge, action filed by the regulators, and I did the takeover, and then local city police saw my notice on the front door, and I'm glad I posted a notice on the front door that this premises has been taken over pursuant to court order. They had shown up that morning with a search warrant, and so they called me and they said that they were proceeding to execute their search warrant. I said, no, you're not. And they said, yes, we are. And then the supervisor got on the line with me and tried to bully me. And I said, you will not go in. There's some jurisdictional issues here. I've been appointed by the federal court. I get into a pissing contest. At the end of the day, we worked it out. I worked cooperatively with them, and it was the local Los Angeles Police Department. They, at the end of the day, they said working with the receiver was the greatest thing. But I stood my ground. I told them they couldn't go in, that they'd be violating the court order. And so it's important to post notices on the premises when you take over. And at the end of the day, it all worked out very cooperatively, but it didn't start that.
Good advice. Melanie, what about you?
I've had a didn't start that way story too. I was appointed I was recommended to be receiver, and while that motion was pending, the U.S. Attorney's Office decided they would execute on their search warrant. And so they went in and took all the documents and all the computers, and they took them to the Eastern District of New York. And so I finally was appointed several days later, and I had to go to the Eastern District of New York to go through the documents to figure out where the assets were. And it really slowed us down in terms of being able to move quickly on certain assets. And I think we lost some things because of that. We weren't able to get to the banks quick enough. And it was one of these things where the SEC, no fault of theirs, they were just behind the U.S. Attorney's Office. And so in the U.S. Attorney's Office, the DOJ, they have different goals. That, you know, they want a criminal prosecution. They're not worried, oh, we need to get the assets recovered as soon as possible. And so we ultimately did also figure out a way to work together, but it took some time, and they actually never gave me the computers. When I had to do computer searches, they were so worried about the evidence that I had to give them the searches, and they would do it and give me the results. And so, you know, there can be problems. You know, as much charm as you can give is good. And, you know, I think they did provide me their understanding and reports, and wound up testifying in one of my matters where I needed firsthand witness. But, you know, there is some tension there working with law enforcement sometimes.
All right. And Jonathan, you had the last 30 seconds. Have you used your charm?
Actually, I don't need to use my charm. Every time the criminal authorities are involved, I have a partner who's a former super senior federal prosecutor. And I say, Teresa, you please call them up and then tell me what we're doing. And that has kept me out of trouble and in the good graces without losing anything and being able to do our job so far.
That's great. Well, thank you, everyone. We've now reached the conclusion of our presentation. I want to thank our panelists for taking the time to present today, and to each of you for attending. Based on the attendance, we're encouraged to add this type of event to our future programming. You'll be receiving a survey about today's program, and we would certainly appreciate your feedback. This being our initial effort on an online format, anything that you have in terms of criticism or comments or suggestions would be welcome. For those of you who want to stick around for a few minutes for additional questions, the panelists and Kathy and I are going to stick around for about 15 minutes. Those of you who wish to log off, thank you again for attending, and we hope and look forward to see all of you at the 2020 NAFER Annual Conference, which will be presented in October. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
So I'm not sure what the format is for questions for those of you who want to stay. Maybe Jennifer, you can chime in. Do they type them into the question and answer, or will they be able to raise their hand and be given audio?
They can raise their hand if they.
Paul has a question about real estate brokers. I don't know if Paul is still here.
Yeah.
I can chime in real quick. There's a question about whether a real estate broker is an important part of the advisory team, and I've sold a lot of real property across the country as a receiver, and a real estate broker is an absolutely important part of the team. There are some key elements that I would expect any real estate broker to know that is going to be part of my team. The first is whether that broker even has a clue what the concept of overbid is. If the answer is no, I'm probably not going to work with them. Also understanding the concept of a public sale. It can be lengthy and timely, and you have to do publication and meet either some federal statutes and guidelines, and understanding the time that takes. Also understanding that as a fiduciary, when we do a sale as a receiver, we are generally not going to be offering any reps or any warranties. The asset's going to be sold on an as-is, where-is basis. Nothing is going to survive the close of escrow. But you do, of course, have to disclose those things for which you have actual knowledge. Also, the concept of getting an order free and clear of liens, where the claims are going to follow the proceeds. That's important for title. And then finally, the issue of the entire transaction being subject to court approval, notwithstanding what's in the purchase and sale agreement, notwithstanding what a broker may have improperly represented to a buyer, which I've seen that happen before. The entire transaction is subject to court approval. Those are some very quick key elements that I would expect a real estate broker on my team to have a great deal of knowledge about.
I would add one thing to that, because that's such great practical advice. This is more on a little more esoteric, is when we have a lot of real estate in a particular receivership, we change the forms that are going to be used to provide that our firm, which has a real estate department, is going to do all the title. We flip the title and the doc stamps. And what that allows us to do is work with the fund or somebody that's a title insurer, and get them very comfortable with the chain of title, because the chain of title is crazy in a lot of these receiverships. And that way, if you can get them to agree to insure title on one, they're going to agree to insure title on all of them. And sometimes being able to provide title insurance is almost as important as good title. And that's been a solution that's helped us get more value for some real estate.
That's great. Any other questions for the panelists? I'm not seeing any in the chat function or in the Q&A. Give folks another minute here.
Kevin, there's one from John Rosardi in the answered at the very bottom that I don't think we answered.
Thank you. Let's take a look. This is from John Rosardi, yes. He asked, when you are still in investigation mode and find some concerns about borrowing-lending relationship that is either very sloppy or intended to bypass normal practices between a FDIC member lender and the target, the borrower, do you notify the FDIC or get it involved in some fashion?
I haven't. We have sued banks from time to time, but I haven't notified the regulatory agency, the FDIC, about that. Have you, Jonathan? Because I know you've sued banks.
According to the banks, I do that all the time, and for no good reason, because banks are always innocent, and they usually are. But no, we've never gone to the FDIC or OCC. I mean, obviously, all of us consult with the agency that we're dealing with the SEC or the FTC. And it never occurred to me that I got to go dig out other regulatory agencies and talk to them up front. Remember, if you sue a bank for $100 million and it's a big bank, that's nothing. It's not going to impact them regulatory wise when they're a $100 billion or more bank. So I'm not sure that's necessary, and it will get they'll have to self-report all the lawsuits, and you might hear from the FDIC.
I had a fight with the FDIC where they were a claimant. One of the Ponzi schemers had invested in a bank that failed, and then we had sort of dual receivership issues, but that's sort of a different issue.
Right.
Claiming the Ponzi schemer, who also then became president of the bank, had run the bank down, and we had claimed that we were entitled to the money that was invested in the bank, and so we wound up resolving those claims by a settlement agreement. But
who would have won that fight?
Well, they claimed very strongly that they would have won, and they have some pretty good statutes that give them priority. But we wound up, I think we wound up with a fair resolution for the investors. But I don't know. I wasn't saying me necessarily. They got some big chops, let's say.
We received another question from Neil Shapiro. He asked, what if a municipality or company goes into receivership and they have a self-funded medical plan for the employees, and the many millions of dollars of medical claims are unpaid by the employer? What happens then?
I have a partner that's a question for, but I'm not the person to answer that.
Yeah, I mean, it depends if they have any assets, right? If there's a way for you as a receiver to handle that situation, if there's nothing, then they might just be claimants like everybody.
They're creditors, yeah.
Sounds good.
I have another question. Practical issues when no automatic stay is involved and channel claims into receivership proceedings. I'm not sure. I think, I don't know, have any of you guys ever been appointed as a receiver where a stay has not been put in place?
In state court, it happens. You still have the Barton Doctrine in state court, though, and you can ask the court to put it, to put a stay in. But I think all the federal court orders now have it automatically. But it comes up often in state court, and you have to ask the judge to stay it or balance the interest then.
Yeah, that's definitely an issue I think you want to raise with your court, and you need to be mindful of what available assets and resources you have, because obviously that's one of the things you're concerned about is you're going to have the resources ebb away while you're fighting on other fronts. So there are times where those types of issues could be helpful, but frequently they're not.
Yeah, and the state court judges don't know about it either. I had to have a whole education system with some of the judges that weren't aware of the idea even that if a receiver was appointed, there should be a stay. And so, you know, I think that's something that comes up in the state court receivership. So this is federal, you know, National Association of Federal Equity Receivers, but I think a lot of us do some state proceedings as well. And so there are a lot more. Those orders are a lot more sloppy from time to time, right? Because they're proposed by parties who might not have that much experience with receivership, or judges that, you know, were criminal practitioners and never had any experience with receiverships either. And so, you know, out in Florida, we're trying to create some forms and some, you know, we recently passed a Uniform Commercial Real Estate Receivership Act that provide some guidance now for the state court judges, but I think it comes up often in state court. And so.
And that statute, I think it became effective last month in July, is great to help educate, I think, the judges. And it's also very similar to the federal that brings everybody along. But you still got to go to the Barton Doctrine. I think, I don't think that's covered. So,
most of my state court equity receivership cases do have a stay provision, but the rents and profits cases where you're just the receiver for the collateral for the loan, for example, do not have that stay provision.
Right. Makes sense.
We have another question. Thank you guys for all your questions. What has your experience been in having your equitable claims overcome a creditor's security interest in a reserve account?
In what account?
In a reserve account?
I haven't honored any security interest in reserve accounts. I think that's sort of the beauty of federal equity receivership as opposed to a bankruptcy, right? Or the beauty of a bankruptcy as opposed to a federal equity receiver, depending on which perspective you have. I think those people with security interests or who would consider themselves to have priority in bankruptcy don't like federal equity receiverships for that reason. But I think when you get to when we're thinking about distribution plans and priorities, we're looking at the victims and not necessarily who had a secured interest, right? And so I think oftentimes we're doing pro rata money in and out and not looking at whether or not they were able to document it better than other people. If it is indeed a fraud, if everything was a fraud. I think it's different if you have a mortgage on a real property, obviously.
Yeah.
But in terms of an account, I don't think I've honored that.
I'm the same way. We're talking about defrauded investors here. Some of them may have tried to perfect their investments and security interests, security agreements, and very different than a secured lender, for example. Yeah, I've had it challenged and have not considered that to be a legitimate reason that one particular defrauded consumer, or well, it wouldn't be a consumer, but investor, should be paid, above the stack behind everybody else. I do think that would be fundamentally inequitable, and I think the courts, in my cases, have agreed.
Yeah, mine too, and it's come up several times where people have claimed different priorities, but were really victims of the same fraud, but they were victims by promissory note as opposed to direct equity investment, so I think that happens often.
Well, that's happening right now with our hedge fund cross-border case, because in the Cayman, their receivership distribution scheme is pretty much just like our bankruptcy scheme, where there's waterfalls, where one level gets 100% before the next level gets another. And one of the rules they have is if you're an investor who made a demand for their money back before the receiver was appointed, you become not an investor but a redemption creditor, and all such folks get paid before the non-redemption investors get paid one dime. And in fact, in my most recent case, we brought that up to the judge because we had to decide whether, in addition to being a receiver, I wanted to be the joint, the fiduciary down in Cayman of the same entities, which makes total sense. But I wanted to bring to the judge's attention that this could result in a highly inequitable distribution if we follow the Cayman scheme. And the Cayman courts, as far as we know, have never ever agreed to negotiate that. It's all or nothing with them. So the judge said, nope, don't go down there. Most of the assets are here in the United States. We'll just ignore Cayman, I guess.
Well, that's what I had one with the Caymans too, and then they became a single creditor in our estate, and then they had to do their distribution however they want to do it, but we only distributed them as if they were one single creditor in our estate. And so
I think that's becoming a common approach in receiverships, although Jonathan, I'm not sure that it's a done deal in terms of there is no other way to distribute under Cayman law. I have a case right now where that's a real discussion point. And depending on the facts and circumstances of the case, that might not be the case. I think the law is going to develop a lot in the next couple of years because there seems to be a lot of activity down there right now, and the interplay with the U.S. receiverships is making a lot of noise down there, I think.
Yes, they have a phrase called internal fraud. Nobody's sure what it means. And when I asked Cayman Counsel, how do I find out if it's an internal fraud? Because if it's an internal fraud, everybody gets treated the same again. And I say, well, does this like fraud in the inducement? Like, there is no creditors, everybody would, and they're like, not exactly, we'll have to bill you a lot of money to tell you if this is an internal fraud. And there's no way to litigate that to conclusion until the very end of the case or something.
Right.
Which means that's what I had to tell the judge. Sorry, you're not going to know for a very long time if that's the case.
Right.
That's a problem for us.
Well, we had a number of attendees who are from the Cayman, so that conversation undoubtedly can continue with them after this presentation. But that does conclude our presentation. I want to thank again the panelists and all the attendees for today. Thank you for making this initial NAFER webinar a great success. Take care. Bye-bye.